I'm going to start off by looking at measuring intra-industry trade again. The logic here is that inter-industry trade in any one sector, so this is one particular industry if you like, is the exports plus the imports relating to that industry's products minus the trade balance but the absolute value of it. And you'll see how this works in a minute. So intra-industry trade for products is equivalent to twice the value of the smaller of exports or imports. Why? Because within an industry, that's how much that is actually going on in terms of the amount of exports and imports that are matched. So we're looking at the match of exports and imports here. Here we can see the IIT share measure, which is what we usually look at to see how much trade is actually intra-industry within a specific sector. So here the IIT share is the IIT, intra-industry trade, divided by total trade. So here it would be exports plus imports minus the absolute value of exports minus imports over exports plus imports. And that equals mathematically 1 minus absolute value x minus m over x plus m. Okay, so let's try and look at the logic of this. If, for instance, x and m were the same amount, you would just get x plus m minus, well, they're the same amount, so it disappears, over x plus m. So it would be 1. In other words, if the amount of exports match the amount of imports in a specific industry, you would get this IIT share to equal 100%, so 1. Now just imagine that you had a different case where, for example, you had x minus m as equaling 0. Well, then we got x plus m over x plus m is equal to 1. So that's when we have the intra-industry trade exactly the same. Now imagine we have a case where x is equal to, x is, say, 0 and m is whatever it is. Well, then at the top we would have m minus the absolute value of minus m, so that's m. So it would be m minus m, so 0 over x plus m, which is just x. So it would be 0, in other words. So if, in other words, there's no trade going both ways of the same goods, then we will get 0. So that's why this intra-industry trade share is an important statistic. So what explains intra-industry trade? I mean, why do we have the exports of the same goods that we import? Well, it's trade driven by comparative advantage, and that comparative advantage can relate to the nature of an imperfectly competitive industry. And that is, it would be characterized by product differentiation. So, for instance, in cars, we export cars and we import cars. Planes, we export planes and we import planes. And it's just different models, basically, of the same product. Also, we've got to consider the transportation costs and the geographical location too. So now we talk about what monopolistic competition is. It's where you have a large number of firms, each producing some kind of variant of a product that consumers view as unique. So these kind of intermediate types of industry structure are what we usually think of as being part of the so-called Krugman model here. Each firm therefore has some kind of degree of monopoly power based on its established production of its unique variety. And we assume that firms can come and go as they please, so they can enter the industry and leave the industry fairly easily. If we have a monopolistically competitive market, for say small compact cars with no trade, first of all, then the first thing we're going to find is that we get differentiation. So the price that the firm can charge decreases as the number of models available in the market increases. So if we have tons and tons of models, then obviously the price is, the firm is not going to be able to necessarily charge a premium over different models. So it was downward sloping in terms of differentiation. Internal scale economies, crowding of models reduces the ability for a firm to achieve scale economies. So the unit cost curve is an upward sloping cost curve. In other words, the more firms you have, the more crowding of models. In other words, the more different types of models there are, but only with small production runs. And so the firm is going to be limited in its ability to achieve scale economies. Lastly, in the long run, with a monopolistically competitive market, firms can enter and leave as they please. So if we now go to free trade around the world, then a domestic automobile company, for example, Ford, is going to look to expand their share of the world markets. And so therefore, they're going to expand into those foreign markets, knowing that they're going to have to advertise and knowing that they have a differentiated product compared to the foreign auto manufacturers. Same thing with foreign automakers. They're going to look to export to the US. So what are the gains from trade here? Well, the gains from trade here are a little different from what we analysed earlier with the Hex-Rollin model or the Ricardian model. The gains from trade here is the fact that consumers have a much wider choice of varieties of products. And that's a good thing. But also because there are so many different types of vehicles, there's going to be increased competition between the producers to attract you to buy their particular vehicle. So we don't have the kind of Hex-Rollin model type of setup where you have quite a big kind of change in the distribution of factor income within the country. Here, the intra-industry trade doesn't really affect the domestic distribution of factor income at all. Gains from greater variety can offset any losses in factor income resulting from inter-industry shifts in production that do occur. Now, we can also look at a different structure, so where you've got a very small number of producers, that's an oligopoly. So I would say the airline industry is a good example of that. So, and he points immediately to that example. So Boeing and Airbus account for nearly all the world's production of large commercial aircraft. Video game consoles is another good example of a global oligopoly. And iron ore companies that mine iron ore, there are very few of them. So this Compañía Vale de Rio Doce, which I believe is a Brazilian company, Rio Tinto, and BH Billiton. Billiton is an Australian company. They mine more than half of the world's iron ore. So if you've got substantial scale economies over a large range of output, then production of a product tends to be concentrated in a few large facilities in a few countries to take advantage of the cost-reducing benefits of the scale economies. So, for instance, Boeing, when it builds its planes, it actually builds them all in the US, and Seattle is the location, and I believe they currently now have a new plant as well in Dallas, where they manufacture aircraft too. Countries that have these production locations export the product. Other countries import the product. So where you've got other oligopolies like game console manufacturers, they're going to have several plants around the world, and because China is such a big market, they're likely to have a an assembly plant at least in China too. How do we look at oligopoly pricing? Well, each firm in an oligopoly is competing with a few other large firms, so any action it takes will provoke reactions from rivals. We call this, where there's interplay between the market participants, we call that game theory. And one of the famous game theory setups is the prisoner's dilemma. And also, when you're looking at oligopoly pricing, you often get cartels being formed. So if the oligopoly firms can restrain their price rivalry, so if they can, try and talk to each other and not compete on the basis of price, then the exporting countries benefit from the higher export prices and they get better terms of trade. External scale economies, also called agglomeration economies, exist when the expansion of an entire industry's production within a geographic area lowers the long-run average cost for each firm in the industry in the area. Production tends to be concentrated in a small number of locations, and countries with these locations tend to export this product. So we talked about here, if you remember, Wall Street, and we also talked about Silicon Valley in the US context. And thank you very much. That concludes the end of this chapter.